Any empire is doomed to collapse no matter how strong and influential it may seem. This statement has stood the test of time so many times that it can be considered an axiom. From ancient Rome to the British Empire, from Austria-Hungary to the Ottoman Porte, every great power built on conquest, subjugation, and assimilation of diverse peoples eventually reached its peak, after which it inevitably began to move toward disintegration. This process is not a question of if, it's a question of when. The modern Russian Federation, despite its official name, is truly an incarnation of the Russian imperial structure, having inherited both vast territories and deep, unresolved ethnic, economic, and political contradictions passed down from its predecessor, the Union of Indecisive Free Republics. Today we will try to model a situation in which modern Russia could collapse, under what circumstances it might break apart, which regions could leave its composition, and when this could happen. Of course, we will also look at the most likely places where national liberation movements could emerge. And finally, we'll talk a bit about how exactly the process of collapse could be accelerated, as always, as objectively as possible and based on historical facts. I'm Semyon. This is Mikoshu Television Forward. Subtitles, Dimatorzok. Why will Russia eventually collapse? Why will Russia eventually collapse? To answer this question, you just need to understand the features of the state structure of post-Soviet Russia. Let me specifically remind you that after 1991, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, many politicians, experts, and even ordinary people sincerely believed that Russia's imperial history had ended once and for all. However, as time has shown, the collapse was incomplete. The Constitution of the Russian Federation, adopted in 1993, although formally written in the spirit of Western democracy and federalism, in reality preserved the Soviet style of governance, which was based on unconditional obedience to orders from Moscow. Even during the period of relative Yeltsin-era liberalism, Russia remained a centralized state that continued to operate according to the logic of imperial preservation of control, suppression of regional autonomy, and the use of aggressive foreign policy to restore lost spheres of influence. Chechnya is a clear example of this. Now let's get to the problem. On the other hand, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse created 15 independent states and sparked strong centrifugal forces within Russia. Many national territorial republics saw these events as a signal to fight for their own sovereignty and expanded rights. And it's not just about Chechnya and its independence, but about many other regions as well. The local elites seemed to wake up after a long winter hibernation and began to fight for greater political, economic, and cultural independence. These aspirations were quite logical and predictable, since they were primarily driven by the desire to control their own natural resources, especially in oil-rich Tatarstan and Bashkortostan and in diamond-rich Yakutia, as well as by the desire for national self-assertion and to get rid of excessive dictates from Moscow. Just like in Soviet times, the regions demanded the right to manage their own budgets, establish foreign economic relations, and even give priority to regional laws over federal ones. At first, Yeltsin tried to pursue a quite reasonable and adequate national policy in the spirit of genuine Western-style federalism. That is, attempting to structure Russia's administration and politics like the United States of America, Germany, or even multi-ethnic India. Nearly everyone has forgotten this. But the first Russian president once seriously told regional leaders, "Take as much sovereignty as you can swallow," which in fact meant an unofficial permission for a significant increase in regional autonomy. However, as they say, the music soon stopped. The traditional Russian longing for a strong hand prevailed over freedom and democracy, and starting from the second half of the 1990s, the central government began systematically destroying them. With the rise to power of the former State Security Lieutenant Colonel, the process of eliminating real federalism was brought to completion. The abolition of direct elections for regional heads, the creation of extra-constitutional federal districts, along with the elimination of the parliamentary opposition, all of these are links in the same chain. The remnants of real sovereignty established in the treaties of the Yeltsin era were annulled, turning the subjects of the Federation into obedient executors of the will of the Moscow Tsar. Such over-centralization, as historical experience shows, sooner or later leads to numerous crises which, under certain circumstances, can easily result in the beginning of the empire's collapse. And now, let's talk about who or what could become the detonator of such a long-awaited process. The formidable Caucasus. Since the 19th century, many writers and socio-political figures have actually predicted the collapse of Russia precisely because of the Caucasus. Taras Shevchenko and Mikhail Lermontov would never let us lie. They always believed this was, is, and will be the empire's Achilles heel. And this is not surprising at all. The Caucasus, with its complex mix of ethnicities and religions, has long served as a borderland between Western and Eastern civilizations. People have always been warriors, valuing freedom and defending it with weapons when needed. Caucasians are actually very similar to Ukrainians. The Zaporizhian Cossacks also lived under similar conditions. That's why it took Russia almost a century to fully subjugate the Caucasus. The 19th century Caucasian War is arguably one of imperial policy's greatest disgraces, rivaled only by the Soviet-Finnish War. And even today, the Caucasus can confidently be called Russia's powder keg, a keg that only needs a spark. I won't specifically dwell on the Chechen wars. There are plenty of videos on this channel dedicated to that topic. I won't even mention modern Chechnya, Kadyrov's Chechnya, which at first seems very loyal to Moscow, where 99% of people always vote for Putin and united Russia, but that's just a facade hiding reality. I'll just say that in world history, there have been plenty of cases when seemingly the most loyal vassals suddenly rose up against their overlords. The classic example familiar to all is the relationship between Pyotr Furs and Ivan Mazepa. The hetman of the Zaporizhian host served the Tsar loyally for nearly 20 years before suddenly joining the Swedes. The same thing could easily happen with Kadyrov or whoever succeeds him on the Chechen throne. Especially if Moscow tightens the tap of unprecedented generosity and Chechnya has to live on its own money, we'll see what's left of the much-praised loyalty then. But it's not just about Chechnya. The Caucasus is united and glorious. Dagestan, Ingushetia, North Ossetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia. There are plenty of options. Any of these republics could easily become the center of a new national liberation uprising. The North Caucasus region in general has a long history of confrontation with Moscow and the Russians. Overall, these events have left a deep mark on the people's memory. Therefore, despite Putin's strict control, certain centrifugal tendencies remain among the local elites. In addition, all these republics are characterized by high unemployment rates, often the highest in Russia, dependence on subsidies, corruption, and a low standard of living, which creates fertile ground for discontent among the broader population. The potential cessation of financial transfers from the federal budget could lead to a rapid economic collapse, chaos, and possibly internal conflicts, which serves as a serious deterrent against separatism for the regional elites. And of course, the religious factor remains. Islam is the dominant religion in the North Caucasus, and radical Muslim teachings such as Wahhabism and Salafism continue to spread, especially among the youth through online propaganda and migration. Such trends, combined with socioeconomic and political reasons, can easily lead to local uprisings and weaken federal control. The Caucasus can still show its formidable strength, so even in the Kremlin, the Tatar land will not go unnoticed. When you ask which republics broke from Moscow's control, everyone thinks of Chechnya. But most people have somehow forgotten that there was another region that for several years was de facto an independent state within the Russian Federation, where the authority of the federal center did not actually apply. This is the Republic of Tatarstan, the historical successor of the Kazan Khanate, once conquered by Ivan Grozny, who also massacred the local population, just as a precaution. But that's all long in the past. In the early 90s, local Tatar elites, who had preserved their national identity despite Russification and Sovietization, decided to seize the opportunity. Kremlin's weakening control over regions created new opportunities to build a real community. In addition, Tatarstan, unlike many subsidized republics, had large oil reserves and a developed oil refining industry. The first president of Tatarstan, Mintimir Shaimiev, and his associates were reluctant to share oil revenues with Moscow and chose to set their own rules. First, the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Tatarstan was adopted, followed by a referendum on March 21, 1992, regarding the Republic of Tatarstan's sovereignty. Consequently, 61% of locals supported state sovereignty for the Republic. On November 30, a new constitution of the Republic of Tatarstan was introduced, declaring it a sovereign state. This document also established the supremacy of republican laws. In addition, Tatarstan, along with Chechnya, categorically refused to sign the federal treaty, which formally established the status of Russian regions. Thus, Tatarstan became a state within a state for a whole 2 years. Unlike Dudaev, the Tatar elites did not pursue war with Russia, though it was possible. Instead, they chose the path of seeking compromise. In other words, they simply bargained for the most favorable conditions for themselves. Since Yeltsin was seriously afraid that the situation in Tatarstan could follow the Chechen scenario, he was forced, albeit reluctantly, to make very significant concessions. After long negotiations, the Treaty on the Republic was signed on February 15, 1994, on the delimitation of areas of jurisdiction and mutual delegation of powers between the state authorities of the Russian Federation and the state authorities of the Republic of Tatarstan. This deal granted Tatarstan a unique and very broad range of powers, effectively establishing confederative relations with Moscow. Tatarstan gained the right to independently manage its land and resources, form its own republican budget, and set republican taxes, and, moreover, to have its own state, to establish and maintain relations with other subjects of the Federation and foreign countries, to create its own national bank, as well as to independently conduct foreign economic activities. Essentially, Tatarstan largely controlled its own economy and domestic policy without prior approval from Moscow, which was unheard of for other subjects of the Federation. Tatarstan's latest status closely resembled Kadyrov's Chechnya, except the Tatar elites lacked their own loyal security forces like the Kadyrovtsi. The autonomy of Tatarstan was of an exclusively economic nature. However, having the legal ability to independently distribute the oil revenues they received, sending only a small portion to Moscow, allowed the local oligarchs to become fabulously wealthy and turn into an influential political force even at the all-Russian level. Of course, after coming to power, Putin did everything to cut back Tatarstan's freedoms, while the local clans, on the contrary, tried to sabotage everything and preserve the privileges everyone had already gotten used to. All available corruption mechanisms were used, of which there are many in Russia, and for some time they managed to stay afloat. However, Moscow's KGB-style control eventually overtook the oil sheiks from Kazan. Although to the credit of Tatarstan, it held out longer than other regions, defending the remnants of its autonomy. The decisive blow to it was dealt in 2017-2019 when the most painful tax reform during all the years of Putin's rule was carried out. It was actually a major rise in business levies despite falling global energy prices. The royal treasury was barely being filled at that time, so they decided to finally clamp down on the overfed Tatar billionaires, and at the same time, tens of thousands of small entrepreneurs, who of course had never been taken into account anyway. Most of the taxes collected in the region go directly to the federal budget, and only then are they redistributed. This naturally reduced Tatarstan's financial autonomy, and through privatization and restructuring mechanisms, the federal center significantly increased its control over the region's major strategic enterprises and raw material resources. The final touch was the symbolic abolition of the post of President of Tatarstan in 2023. Until then, two people in Russia held that position, one in the Kremlin and one in Kazan. However, the charming dwarf deprived the Tatars even of such ceremonial autonomy. Today, of course, Tatarstan is completely loyal to Moscow, but the hidden internal stance hasn't gone anywhere. All the more so because it has one of the most cohesive and influential regional elites in Russia, which has historically been ready to defend its interests. If not openly, then at least behind the scenes. Being one of the few donor regions in Russia, the oil giant Tatarstan has a powerful economic base, which by default makes it a very influential player. If control from Moscow weakens, if that happens, it's possible that the situation could revert to the 1990s. This time, local oligarchs will likely be more determined and turn declarative sovereignty into real sovereignty. After all, Tatarstan has the financial and organizational resources to exist independently. It definitely won't be lost without Mother Russia. And let's not forget the cultural and religious factor. Islam and Eastern culture dominate in this region. And as the hero of a famous Soviet film said, the East is a delicate matter. Another region that could break from Moscow's control is the Urals, the oldest and largest industrial area in Russia. It's like our pre-war Donbass, not what the much-praised Russian world has made it. So the Urals are still the most important center of metallurgy, heavy engineering, and the chemical industry. It's one of the few regions in Russia where they don't just mindlessly extract resources from the ground, but actually create real added value. Therefore, if the Urals separated from Moscow, they could fully provide for themselves. Unlike Tatarstan or Chechnya, the Urals lack strong cultural traditions or a history of fighting for independence. However, there was still a certain attempt, although it was purely for economic reasons and not for national liberation. We're talking about the Ural Republic, which actually existed in 1993 with its center in Yekaterinburg. This isn't just a historical curiosity, but a real effort by regional elites led by Edouard Roussel to gain more economic benefits. The Urals money was going to the federal budget, while almost nothing was allocated for the needs of the Urals, and surviving in the developing economic crisis had to be done solely by relying on their own resources. The local establishment was clearly inspired by Tatarstan, which successfully operated with broad economic autonomy. The Ural Republic lasted less than a year. Yeltsin was mortally afraid of the further spread of centrifugal tendencies, and therefore, under the pretext of a threat to the unity of the state, he nipped the strengthening of the Urals' role in the bud. However, he had to make significant concessions and agree to let some of the locally earned revenue remain in the region. After all, in the 1990s, those in power were still used to negotiating as equals, not like now, when people mindlessly salute and obey. And just to complete the picture, I'll add that right next door, between the Urals and the Volga region, is the Republic of Bashkiria, or more correctly, Bashkortostan, and it's rich in several ways. In the 1990s, the Bashkir elite, led by the local party boss Murtaza Rakimov, also tried to follow the path of Tatarstan, pursuing a course toward maximum sovereignty. And in 1994, they managed to negotiate a legally formalized agreement with Yeltsin, which provided for broad economic preferences and real political autonomy. Around 70% of collected taxes stayed in Bashkortostan. Of course, the rise to power of the gatherer of Russian lands ultimately nullified all these efforts to achieve economic independence. However, the ambitions of the Bashkir princes and their memory of former privileges did not disappear. Ultimately, both the Urals and Bashkiria, separately or together, represent a potentially powerful and explosive mix that could also play an important role in the collapse of Russia. And again, I want to emphasize that these regions, unlike parasitic, eternally subsidized Chechnya, are absolutely self-sufficient economically. And they will easily be able to live without the ever-present big brother from Moscow. And what's out there beyond the Urals? What's there? Technically, it has been stated that the collapse of almost all empires usually began with those regions that are geographically the most distant from the center, simply because it is technically and organizationally extremely difficult to control them from the capital. Of course, Siberia and the Far East fit this definition perfectly. Yes, of course, many will say, like, what kind of mutineers are they? Everything there is covered with permafrost, and not just the ground, but the people too. And indeed, it's hard to find any other options. Russia has more apolitical and obedient regions, especially since they are sparsely populated and have poorly developed infrastructure, which by default could hinder any real anti-government unrest. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions. On the contrary, these regions also have experience, if not in open armed struggle, then certainly in resisting Moscow and its imperial ambitions. And no, we're not talking about the resistance of the indigenous Siberian peoples to the conquering pioneers, nor about the Far Eastern Republic that existed during the years of the Civil War. Most people have forgotten about that. But in the 1990s, Yakutia, known for its diamonds and gold, declared itself the Republic of Sakha. At the official level, it was proclaimed a sovereign, democratic, and legal state. The quickly adopted constitution let the republic control its mineral resources and gave its president the power to form an army. However, in practice, this provision was not implemented. Still, the disobedient Yakuts caused quite a stir in Moscow. It should be noted that the issue of complete secession and separation from Russia, as happened with Chechnya, was not raised by the leadership of Yakutia at that time, at least not openly. Its main goal was to achieve the greatest possible sovereignty within the federation of equal peoples and, of course, independent control over its natural resources. Therefore, by 1995, the local leaders sat down at the negotiating table with Yeltsin and, as you correctly guessed, bargained for broad economic and political rights. First and foremost, regarding diamond mining. Of course, all these agreements fell apart under Putin's extreme centralization. Today, representatives of the regional establishment may keep a low profile, but they are clearly extremely dissatisfied with the current state of affairs. You don't have to be a fortune teller to see that. Siberia and the Far East have enormous natural resources. At least 70% of Russia's oil and gas is extracted from their territories, but in return they receive only a small share of the profits, since Putin's model of exploiting the provinces involves redistributing funds through Moscow. This is seen not only by local elites, but by any reasonable person as real economic colonialism, which in essence is not much different from the former British, French, or Portuguese colonial empires, except those empires ceased to exist long ago. But the Russian one just won't die. It's unfair. However, there's another nuance that makes the situation in these regions completely different from other parts of Russia. In real anti-government protests, it could help, if not lead to Russia's collapse, then at least to its separation. This is the factor of China, which for several centuries has been eyeing Siberia and the Far East with longing, sincerely believing that these rich lands are unfairly part of Russia. Moreover, if we're being honest, all these Buryats, Yakuts, Tuvans, Altaians, and Caucasus are closer to China both ethnically and culturally than to Russia. So, if the federal center weakens significantly, Beijing could quickly act to escalate destabilization for its own interests. China's role in these regions is growing every year, and it's not just about huge Chinese investments in the mining and timber industries, but also about real Chinese settlers who are ready to work and earn money. Officially, there are about 20,000 Chinese people in Russia, but estimates suggest hundreds of thousands live in Irkutsk Oblast, Krasnoyarsk Krai, and Primory. Statisticians just don't count them as permanent residents. Most of them are seasonal labor migrants who work in agriculture, forestry, logging, and construction, most notably in wholesale and retail trade at markets. Due to depopulation in Siberia and the Far East, the Chinese factor could potentially contribute to Russia's internal collapse under certain conditions, especially since Putin himself dismantled the previously existing system of international law, which placed a ban on changing borders at its core. Annexing Crimea and 4 Ukrainian regions really opened Pandora's box. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that instead of some hypothetical Siberian federation, in reality, China's territory will be expanded with new provinces, which will first be settled by Chinese people. And this is not a fantasy at all, but quite a logical result of the processes currently taking place. We are accelerating historical processes. As you can see, there are quite a few regions that could very well leave Russia, both for national religious reasons and for purely selfish socio-economic reasons. It cannot maintain its integrity long term. A technologically backward state that survives solely by effectively plundering its provinces cannot endure. An autocratic state spanning 1/7 of Earth's land, yet with fewer people than Bangladesh, due to declining revenues and growing national consciousness among non-Russian peoples. The last factor is especially significant for regions dominated by Islam, which by definition means a high birth rate. At this rate, who knows what will happen in a few years? In about 50 years, Moscow could easily be renamed to Moskva-Bat. But seriously, without deep internal transformations and reforms aimed at decentralization and democratization of the state, Russia is definitely doomed to collapse. The existing Putin model simply doesn't allow for any progress. It only involves consuming natural resources and maintaining the stability of the ruling regime. The system works to sustain itself, that's well known. A necessary condition for Russia breaking up into separate states is the weakening of the federal center, especially its main support, the security apparatus. As soon as this statistical parasite weakens, make no mistake, the conquered peoples will rise up quickly, and the dissatisfaction with the existing order and the ambitions of regional clans, who never wanted to share their spoils with the eternally greedy and ungrateful Moscow, will surface. The most ideal scenario for the breakup of Russia is a repeat of the 1917 scenario when political instability, internal strife, and economic troubles are compounded by an unfavorable external factor, preferably military failures. Russia's defeat could become the trigger for the process of destabilization and defragmentation of the state. That is why the outcome of the current Russian-Ukrainian war will most likely determine Russia's future for many decades to come. The key is that Ukraine must benefit from the conflict. As Zbigniew Brzezinski said, Russia can't be an empire without Ukraine. He was right after all. That's all from me, folks. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you to the sponsors for supporting the channel. See you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.